Have you ever noticed that there are people who are going through the same challenges as you, but seem to have access to an invisible force that sustains them, as if there was a hidden architecture organizing the chaos within them while you struggle trying to maintain your sanity? Have you ever wondered why certain words from the Bible stick in your mind when everything falls apart, while all of modern psychology slips through your fingers like sand? There is something in the structure of this ancient book that is not just religious or moral, something that Simone Weil discovered after years of wrestling with her own fragmented mind. And what she found goes against everything we have been taught about how our consciousness works. The Bible is not just a collection of moral stories or spiritual rules. It is a system of mental engineering so precise that you can feel your mind reorganizing itself as you read, as if each word were a brick placed exactly where it should be in the invisible architecture of human thought. Simone Weil was not a devout Christian. When she began reading the Bible, she was a secular Jewish philosopher plagued by migraines that made her want to die, a factory worker who knew physical brutality, a brilliant intellectual who never felt smart enough, and she began reading this book, not looking for God, but looking for something that could structure the unbearable pain she carried every day without anesthesia. And what happened was not a sudden religious conversion. It was a gradual discovery that the Bible operates as a matrix of thought, a pattern that replicates itself in consciousness when you stop reading it as literature and start letting it build something inside you. You feel that sometimes, don't you? That moment when a biblical phrase that you didn't even remember you knew appears in your mind exactly when you need it most, as if it had been planted there decades ago, waiting for that precise moment to germinate. It's not ordinary memory, it's activated architecture. Simone Weil realized that the Bible does not convince through logic or move through poetry. It structures through the repetition of specific patterns that become foundations of thought. And when you understand these patterns, when you see invisible engineering working, your relationship with your own mind changes completely. There is a reason why people in utter desperation cling to Bible verses and not quotes from modern philosophy. There is a reason why these ancient words have the power to organize mental chaos when all else fails. And Simone Weil has dedicated years to deciphering this hidden engineering. And if you feel that these words are touching something you have always suspected but never been able to name, if you feel that there is invisible architecture in your own mind waiting to be discovered, then subscribe to this channel now, because let's dive together into Simone's most radical discovery. We'll talk about how the Bible literally builds structures within human consciousness, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Because what she discovered about biblical patterns will completely change the way you understand not just religion, but the very architecture of human thought. First, we need to name something you probably already feel, but are afraid to admit. Your mind doesn't work well. It's not that you're crazy or sick, but there is constant fragmentation, dispersion that you carry as a normal condition of modern existence. You wake up and start the game of keeping 1,000 pieces of yourself organized. The demands of work pulling one way, relationships pulling another, unresolved memories emerging at random moments, anxieties about the future competing with regrets about the past, and in the middle of it all, you try to find something that feels like the real you. But most days, you are just a desperate manager of internal chaos. Simone Weil knew this fragmentation intimately. She described in her journals how her mind felt broken in 1,000 directions, how thoughts multiplied uncontrollably, how physical pain from migraines mixed with mental anguish from never feeling smart enough, good enough, present enough. She worked in a factory during the day, her hands bleeding on the machines, and at night she tried to think philosophically, but discovered that she could no longer sustain complex thought because physical fatigue had fragmented her ability to concentrate. And it was in this state of despair, when all the intellectual tools she possessed failed, that something unexpected happened. She began memorizing religious poems, especially the work of the English poet George Herbert, not because she believed in the words, but because she needed something to structure the chaos. And he discovered that when he recited these poems in his mind, especially during more intense migraine attacks, something changed. It wasn't that the pain disappeared, but the fragmentation decreased. The 1,000 conflicting voices in his head began to organize themselves around the memorized words, as if the verses were invisible axes around which scattered thoughts could orbit without colliding. Have you ever experienced this? Moments in which a phrase, a song, a verse temporarily organizes internal chaos? It's not distraction, it's structuring. And Simone Weil realized that the Bible, more than any other text she knew, had this ability to create order without imposing authoritarianism, to structure without suffocating. But she wasn't satisfied with just personal experience. She wanted to understand the mechanics, the invisible engineering that allowed ancient words to have this power over fragmented modern consciousness. So she began to study not just the content of the Bible, but its structure, its patterns, its internal architecture. And what he discovered was revolutionary. The Bible is not constructed like Greek philosophy, which proceeds by linear logical arguments. It is not constructed like modern poetry, which seeks originality and rupture. The Bible is built by repetition of patterns, by structures that are repeated on different scales, by themes that constantly return but never in the same form, creating a network of intertwined meanings that becomes a foundation on which the mind can rest. It is fractal architecture, where even a small piece contains a pattern of the whole. When you read about creation in Genesis, you are finding a pattern that is then repeated in the Exodus from Egypt, which is then repeated in the return from exile, which is then repeated in the resurrection. Always the same movement: initial chaos, ordering word, separation of the waters, emergence of life, rest. This pattern is not just a story told several times. It is a structure that is recorded in the consciousness of whoever reads it, becoming a matrix through which the person can organize their own experience. And Simone Weil realized that this is the secret of biblical engineering. It doesn't give you ready-made answers. It gives you structuring patterns that you can apply to the chaos of your own life. You do not need to believe in literally 6 days of creation to feel the organizing power of the creation chaos word order life pattern operating in your consciousness. When your life is in complete chaos, when everything seems like darkness on the face of the abyss, having a mental pattern that says there is a word that can separate light from darkness, there is a possibility of order emerging from chaos. This is not cheap religious consolation. It is a cognitive foundation upon which you can begin to rebuild. But modern society has taught us to dismiss this as primitive superstition, taught us that we are too rational, too sophisticated to need ancient structures. And the result is that we live in absolute fragmentation, using psychological tools that describe problems but do not build a foundation, that analyze fragments but do not offer an integrative architecture. Simone Weil saw this with brutal clarity. She saw that modernity had destroyed ancient structures without building anything in their place, leaving the human mind without foundations, and then offering only superficial symptom management techniques: meditation to calm anxiety, positive affirmations to counter negative thoughts, therapy to process trauma, all useful, nothing deep enough to rebuild mental architecture that has been demolished. And you feel that, don't you? You go to therapy, practice mindfulness, read self-help books, and it all helps a little, but deep down there's a feeling that you're just managing chaos instead of building true order. Because modern tools weren't made for building foundations. They were made for superficial repairs. The Bible, according to Simone Weil, does not repair surface, it rebuilds foundation. But to understand how, we need to go deeper. The first thing Simone Weil discovered about biblical engineering is that it operates through what she calls attention to. Not attention as forced concentration, but attention as total openness to what is, without attempt to manipulate or control. And the Bible is an attention training manual disguised as religious history. Think of Job. Here is a man who loses everything: health, family, wealth, dignity, and his friends come up with all the logical explanations, all the attempts to make sense of suffering, all the theologies that justify pain. And Job rejects them all. He doesn't want an explanation, he wants presence. He doesn't want someone to make sense of his pain. He wants someone to witness his pain without trying to fix it. And in the end, when God finally appears, God explains nothing. God simply shows Job the immensity of creation, the incomprehensible complexity of the universe, and something in Job changes. Not because he understood his suffering, but because his attention was redirected from his own wounded ego to something greater. Simone Weil saw this and realized, the Bible is not trying to make you feel better. You are trying to expand your attention span beyond the limits of your own suffering. When you are fragmented, all your attention is consumed by conflicting pieces of yourself. You are constantly trying to solve, fix, understand, control every fragment. And the more you try, the more fragmented it becomes. The Bible offers a radical alternative. Stop trying to control the fragments and direct attention to larger patterns that contain the fragments without denying them. When Abraham is called to leave his land, his family, his known identity, he does not receive a detailed map of the future. He receives only direction, go, and promise, I will be with you. This pattern repeats itself incessantly in the Bible. Moses at the burning bush, David facing Goliath, Mary receiving annunciation, disciples leaving fishing nets. Always the same movement, letting go of what is known, trusting in the call, walking without seeing the entire path. And when you read these stories repeatedly, not just once but dozens, hundreds of times throughout your life, the pattern becomes engraved in your consciousness. You don't learn abstract theology. You learn structure of movement that you can apply when your own life demands that you let go of something known. Simone Weil realized that this is engineering, not casual inspiration. The Bible is systematically building in your mind a library of structuring patterns that become available exactly when you need them. And even deeper, the Bible doesn't give you these standards as rules to follow. It gives you them as stories to live by. You don't read about Abraham as an outside observer. You are invited to identify with his dilemma, feel afraid of him, make his choice. And when you do this repeatedly with dozens of biblical characters, something happens. You develop cognitive flexibility, the ability to see your own situation from multiple perspectives. You are no longer stuck in your single fragmented narrative. You have access to the entire library of narratives that can reorganize your experience. This is not religion in the traditional sense. It is sophisticated cognitive technology. But there is a second, deeper layer. The Bible doesn't just offer narrative patterns. It offers specific language that structures thought in ways that modern language cannot. Simone Weil studied biblical Hebrew and Koine Greek not out of religious devotion, but out of philosophical curiosity, and discovered something surprising. These ancient languages have structures that force certain types of thinking that modern languages avoid. In Hebrew, there is no abstract word for time like we have in Portuguese. There is only a sequence of actions, events that unfold. This forces the mind to think not in abstract concepts, but in concrete movements. When you read the original, you don't think I need to have more faith. You think I need to take action to trust. I need to take action to believe. The difference seems subtle, but it is revolutionary. Abstract concepts float in the mind without anchorage. Concrete actions create rails along which thought can move. The Bible forces you to think in terms of actions, not in terms of emotional states or psychological concepts. You're not depressed. You're making the movements of someone who has forgotten how to praise. You don't have anxiety. You are following the pattern of someone you no longer trust. See the difference? One is a diagnosis that paralyzes you into a fixed identity. The other is a description of movement that can be changed. Simone Weil realized that modern language traps us in fixed psychological identities. I am anxious, I am depressed, I am traumatized, while biblical language keeps us moving. I am doing pattern. God is love, but allows suffering. God chooses specific people, but loves all nations. Jesus preaches peace, but brings a sword. Blessed are the poor, but also the peacemakers who build. The modern mind hates contradiction, wants to resolve everything in a clean synthesis, wants to eliminate ambiguity. And the result is shallow thinking that cannot sustain the complexity of real human experience. The Bible refuses to resolve its contradictions, and in doing so, it forces the reader to develop what Weil called second-order attention, the ability to hold two opposites true simultaneously without collapsing into one or the other. This is not mental confusion, it is cognitive sophistication. It's the ability to live in a world where things are both terrible and beautiful, where you can be simultaneously lost and guided, broken and being rebuilt. Modernity offers only either or. Either you are good or you are bad. Either the relationship works or it fails, or you work well, satisfies or does not satisfy. The Bible offers and. You can be in darkness and in the presence of light. You can be dying and being resurrected. You can be lost and still on the way. And Simone Weil realized that this ability to sustain paradox without resolving it is exactly what the modern fragmented mind needs most. Because fragmentation comes from a desperate attempt to forcibly resolve internal contradictions. You have part that wants connection and part that is afraid of vulnerability. and instead of supporting both, you try to eliminate one of them, and the result is fragmentation. The Bible trains you, story after story, contradiction after contradiction, to sustain opposites without collapsing, and this training rebuilds mental architecture that modernity demolished. But before we go deeper into this invisible engineering, I need to pause and know where you are watching this video from right now, because there is something profoundly important in knowing that all around the planet, right now, there are people discovering with me these ancient structures that still function in modern consciousness. So tell me in the comments, from which city, from which country are you seeking these truths about mental architecture and the power of biblical language? Leave your location below, because Simone Weil believed that truth becomes more real when it is recognized in community, when we see that we are not alone in this search for deeper foundations of what modernity offers. So share with me where you watch us. And now let's dive even deeper, because what Simone Weil discovered next about how the Bible structures not just thought, but perception of reality will completely change the way you understand why certain words have the power to reorganize internal chaos when nothing else works. The second descent into biblical engineering that Simone Weil has charted is more disturbing because it reveals something about how the Bible deliberately deconstructs illusions we hold about ourselves. Modernity teaches us that self-esteem is fundamental, that we need to love ourselves, that we are enough as we are. The Bible says the absolute opposite. You are deeply broken, your heart is deceitful above all things, your righteousness is filthy rags, you cannot even begin to understand the depth of your own corruption. And Simone Weil realized that this is not religious masochism, it is surgical precision. The Bible is not trying to make you feel bad, it is trying to destroy the fundamental illusion that keeps you fragmented. The illusion that you are the moral center of the universe, that your judgments are correct, that your perspective is reality. Think of Peter, a disciple who was absolutely certain of his loyalty. I will never deny you, even if everyone else denies you, I will be with you until death. Total conviction, genuine sincerity, seemingly solid self-knowledge. And then the rooster comes crowing 3 times, and Pedro discovers that he knew absolutely nothing about himself, that his deepest convictions were sandcastles, that he was capable of betraying exactly what he swore to protect with his life. And this is not a narrative accident. It is a deliberate pattern. David, a man after God's own heart, commits adultery and murder. Moses, the chosen leader, is prevented from entering the promised land for a moment of disobedience. Paul, apostle of the Gentiles, was a fanatical persecutor of the church. The Bible systematically demonstrates that human self-knowledge is a cruel joke, that what you believe most certainly about yourself is probably wrong, that you cannot trust your own judgments about your own goodness. And Simone Weil saw genius in it, because as long as you believe you know yourself well, as long as you trust your own moral assessments, you are stuck in fragmentation. Because each fragment of you is judging the other fragments, creating an internal hierarchy where good parts are at war with bad parts, and you as a judge trying to decide which part deserves to exist. The Bible destroys this entire structure by saying, you are not a competent judge, even of yourself. Your ability to judge is irreparably compromised. Stop trying to be a judge and accept being a defendant who needs mercy. This is not humiliation, it is liberation. Because when you stop trying to judge yourself, when you accept that you can't determine which parts of yourself are acceptable and which should be eliminated, you can finally stop being at war internally. You can bring all the fragments, even the horrible ones, even the shameful ones, and place them before something bigger than you that can integrate them without you needing to understand how. But there is an even deeper layer to this deconstruction engineering. The Bible not only attacks the illusion of moral self-knowledge, it attacks the illusion of control. You probably live as if you have control over your life, making plans, setting goals, believing what willpower is enough. The Bible says, you control nothing. James chapter 4. You who say today or tomorrow, we will go to that city, do business and make money, you don't even know what will happen tomorrow. You are fog that appears for a moment and then disappears. Proverbs. Man's heart plans his path, but it is the Lord who directs his steps. Jesus. Which of you, no matter how much you worry, can add even 1 hour to your life? And Simone Weil realized that this is not depressive fatalism, it is a precise antidote for modern anxiety. Because anxiety comes from the illusion that you should be in control but are not. You blame yourself for not being able to control anxious thoughts, not being able to control emotional reactions, not being able to control the results of your actions. And Bible says, you were never in control to begin with. Stop blaming yourself for not having power that you never had. Accept that you are fog, that life is radically uncertain, that tomorrow is a complete mystery. Not because this should terrify you, but because this is the truth that frees you from the prison of the illusion of control. When you accept that you don't control anything really important, you can stop wasting energy trying to control and start directing attention to the one move the Bible says is available to you. Trust. Don't trust yourself. The Bible has already demolished that. Trust in patterns bigger than yourself, in structures that support reality regardless of your ability to understand or control them. And there is a third illusion that the Bible methodically deconstructs. The illusion that you deserve good things and do not deserve bad things. The entire book of Job is dedicated to exploding this illusion. Job is described as the most righteous man on earth, and then he loses absolutely everything. Your friends come with dessert theology. You must have sinned secretly. God would not punish you justly. Your tragedy is evidence of your hidden guilt. And Job knows this is a lie. He knows he did nothing to deserve destruction, and he demands that God explain. And when God finally response is not about worthiness at all. God simply says, "Do you see this immensity of creation? Do you understand how it works? Were you there when foundations were laid?" And the point is not to humiliate Job, but to show that the universe does not operate according to the logic of human merit. Good things happen to terrible people. Horrible things happen to wonderful people. And trying to make sense of this through the logic of merit is an exercise in futility that only multiplies suffering. Because if you believe you deserve good things, then when bad things happen, you go into an existential crisis trying to figure out what you did wrong. And if you believe you don't deserve good things, then when they happen, you live in anxiety waiting for them to be taken away. The Bible offers an alternative. You don't live in a universe of merit. You live in a universe of grace. Good things that come are undeserved gifts. Bad things that come are not deserved punishments. Everything is more mysterious, more complex, more interconnected than your little logic of moral cause and effect can comprehend. And Simone Weil saw that this deconstruction of the three illusions, moral, self-knowledge, control, merit, is not religious cruelty, but necessary surgery. Because these illusions are prisons. As long as you believe you know yourself morally, you are fragmented into internal judge and defendant. While you believe you have control, you are anxious about everything that escapes you. While you believe in deserving, you are either arrogant when good things happen or devastated when bad things come. The Bible deconstructs all these prisons not to leave you in despair, but to free you to a completely different way of existing. A way of radical humility that is paradoxically much more stable than any manufactured self-esteem. Because when you accept that you don't know yourself, that you have no control, that you deserve neither good things nor bad things, you can finally stop living as if the universe revolves around you and your moral evaluations. You can inhabit reality as it is, not as you think it should be. And this movement, according to Simone Weil, is an absolute prerequisite for any true mental integration. The third and deepest descent into biblical engineering is where Simone Weil encountered something she did not expect, and that completely changed not only her thinking, but her experience of existing. She discovered that the Bible is not just a manual for deconstructing illusions, it is a matrix for reconstruction on a completely different foundation. And this foundation is called, in biblical language, covenant. But not a covenant as you understand it today, as a contract between equal parties. Biblical covenant is a relationship pattern where identity does not come from self-sufficiency, but from connection with something radically greater. Pen into how modern identity works. You believe that you discover who you are by looking inside, exploring your feelings, your desires, your preferences. Self-knowledge is an internal excavation project, and the more you dig, the more fragments you find, and the harder it becomes to determine which fragment is the real you. The Bible offers a completely opposite model. Identity does not come from within, it comes from alliance. Abraham does not discover who he is by looking inside. He discovers who he is through a call that comes from outside, through a promise that constitutes him as a father of nations before he even has a son. Moses does not become a leader through a journey of self-knowledge. He becomes a leader because he is called to the burning bush and inserted into a larger narrative. Pedro does not discover his identity through therapy or introspection. He receives a new name and a mission that defines him. And Simone Weil realized that this is deep relational engineering, because when your identity comes from alliance with something greater than yourself, all the internal fragments can finally organize themselves around that external axis. You no longer need to discover which fragment is the true you, because the true you is constantly being constituted through calling from outside. It's not that you don't matter, it's that you matter precisely because you are being called to participate in something infinitely bigger than yourself. And this structure solves a problem that modern therapy cannot solve: how to integrate fragments without having a central self that already exists before integration. Because if you need core self to organize fragments, but core self only exists after fragments are organized, you are in an impossible paradox. The Bible resolves this by saying, self does not come first, covenant comes first. You are constituted by being called, by responding, by being inserted into a larger narrative. And then, internal fragments naturally organize around that alliance, not because you forced integration, but because alliance provides gravity around which everything can orbit. But there is an even deeper layer to this alliance engineering. The Bible does not describe covenant as something static that you accept once, and you are done. Alliance is a pattern of breaking and constant renewal. Israel receives covenant at Sinai, breaks covenant by worshiping golden calf. Covenant is renewed. David makes an alliance with God, breaks an alliance with Bathsheba. The alliance is renewed through repentance. Peter declares alliance with Jesus, denies Jesus 3 times. Alliance is renewed after the resurrection. And Simone Weil saw that this pattern of breakage and renewal is not a failure in the system, it is the system. Because you will break, you will fail. You will act against everything you said you believed. And if your identity depends on your ability to maintain moral integrity, you are doomed to collapse. But if your identity is in a covenant that can be renewed even after it is broken, then failure is not the end, it is part of the pattern. You can fail completely, acknowledge failure honestly, and come back. Not because you deserve a second chance, but because alliance by nature includes the possibility of infinite renewal. This is not permission to deliberately sin, as Paul warns. It is realistic recognition that you will fail because you are human, and human existence is inevitably marked by failure and needs structure that can sustain failure without collapsing. And the third layer of alliance engineering is more mysterious, but perhaps more powerful. The Bible describes covenant not just as a relationship between you and God, but as participation in a larger covenant that already exists. Before you were born, there was already an alliance. Abraham, Moses, David, prophets, all participating in the same covenant that unfolds through generations. And when you enter into a covenant, you are not starting something new. You are being grafted onto something that was already happening. You are inserted into a narrative that began long before you and will continue long after you. And Simone Weil realized that this creates the type of belonging that modernity cannot manufacture. Because modernity tells you, create your own narrative, write your own story, be the author of your life. And the result is terrifying loneliness of being solely responsible for giving meaning to your existence. The Bible says, you don't need to create narrative. You need to discover which larger narrative you are being called to participate in. You are not an author. You are a character in a much larger story. And it doesn't diminish you. It frees you from the prison of having to create meaning out of nothing. You can rest in the fact that history is already happening. Your role is to figure out how to participate in it faithfully. And when you do this, when you accept being part of a larger narrative instead of the author of your own narrative, fragmentation decreases drastically. Because fragments no longer need to create meaning, they just need to participate in meaning that already exists. Simone Weil tried it only in person in a dramatic way. For years she resisted baptism, refused to become an official member of the church because part of her wanted to maintain intellectual autonomy. But she realized that she was being called to something, that there was alliance being offered, and that her refusal to fully enter into that alliance was keeping her fragmented. She was never baptized before she died, but her writings show that she was struggling with this calling constantly, and her struggle reveals something important. Entering into an alliance is terrifying because it means letting go of the illusion of total autonomy. It means accepting that you are not the center, that you are part of something bigger that has authority over you. Modernity teaches that this is slavery. Simone Weil discovered that this is freedom because total autonomy is a prison of absolute solitude, while alliance is belonging that finally organizes internal chaos around an external stable axis. What the pain of this discovery taught Simone Weil, and what it can teach you now, is that mental structure is not something you create on your own through heroic effort of will or prolonged therapy. Mental structure is something that is given when you accept being inserted into patterns bigger than yourself. The Bible is not a book that you read to extract information or inspiration. It is a matrix into which you allow yourself to be inserted so that it can rebuild the architecture of your thinking from the inside out. And that hurts because it means death to the illusion that you can build yourself, death to the modern fantasy of psychological self-sufficiency. Simone Weil went through a factory, through war, through self-imposed hunger, but she said that the intellectual pain of accepting her own insufficiency was worse than any physical pain, because she was a brilliant philosopher who always believed that rigorous thought was enough to organize existence, and discovering that there was something greater than thought, something that thought had to undergo in order to be organized, that was crucifixion of the intellectual ego. But on the other side of this crucifixion, she found something that no philosophy had given: peace in the midst of fragmentation, not because fragmentation disappeared, but because there was finally an axis around which fragments could orbit without destroying each other. She learned that you don't need to eliminate internal contradictions. You need structure strong enough to sustain contradictions without collapsing. And that structure doesn't come from psychological strength or emotional resilience. It comes from accepting to be grounded in something that doesn't depend on you. When she recited the Lord's Prayer in Greek during migraine attacks, it wasn't that words magically removed pain. It was that words provided temporary architecture within which she could exist, even as pain tried to fragment her into 1,000 pieces. The words were like construction beams holding the roof in place while the storm tried to tear it down. And she realized that this was no psychological trick. It was precisely how the human mind was designed to work. We were not meant to be psychologically self-sufficient. We were made to be grounded in larger patterns, in larger narratives, in larger alliances. And modernity, by removing all these foundations in the name of individual autonomy, has not freed us. It has left us with no ground under our feet, trying to float in the void through sheer force of will. And the result is an epidemic of fragmentation, anxiety, depression, a feeling of lack of meaning, not because we are weak, but because we are trying to do something impossible, build a stable identity from nothing without an external foundation. The Bible offers foundation, but foundation that you do not control, foundation that exists before you and will continue after you, foundation that you can only accept and submit to and allow to organize you. And this submission is exactly what the modern ego resists most, because we were taught that submission is weakness. But Simone Weil discovered that submission to the greatest is the only form of true strength, because it gives you something to hold on to when everything inside you is falling apart. Now we need to talk about how you actually live with this discovery, because discovery without practice is just another beautiful concept floating around in the fragmented mind. Simone Weil didn't just theorize about biblical engineering. She developed concrete practices based on that engineering. And these practices are not traditional religious rituals. They are precise exercises in mental reconstruction. The first practice she developed was what she called mindful recitation. Choose a specific biblical text, generally no more than a few verses, and recite it mentally with absolute attention, word for word, without allowing your mind to get lost in digressions or interpretations. The goal is not to understand intellectual meaning. It is to allow the structure of the words to build a temporary foundation in consciousness. She discovered that Our Father, it worked particularly well because it has a clear structure, natural rhythm, and logical progression of requests. When you recite, you don't ask for random things, you follow the pattern. Recognition of paternity, sanctification of the name, coming of the kingdom, will being done, bread for today, forgiveness of debts, protection from temptation, deliverance from evil. This pattern is not arbitrary. It is an architecture of relationship with the transcendent. And when you recite mindfully, you are not just saying words, you are temporarily rebuilding that architecture within your own consciousness. After 20 minutes of mindful recitation during a migraine attack, Simone Weil reported that the physical pain did not lessen, but she was no longer being destroyed by the pain, because there was structure supporting her through the pain. The second practice she developed was slow, repetitive reading of the same biblical text for prolonged periods. Not reading the entire Bible quickly, but staying with the same psalm, the same gospel chapter, the same parable for weeks, months, until the text stops being text and becomes the mental landscape that you inhabit. She spent months with just Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd," not interpreting, not studying comments, just inhabiting the text, allowing its images to build interior architecture. Valley, calm waters; table, prepared in the presence of enemies; oil on the head, overflowing cup, kindness and mercy following. These are not just pretty metaphors, they are structural components of the way of existing in the world. And when you inhabit text like this long enough, it stops being something you read and becomes something you are. The way you perceive reality changes because internal architecture has changed. The third practice was what she called attention to the unresolved paradox, taking two biblical passages that seem to contradict each other and holding them both true simultaneously without trying to reconcile them intellectually. For example, God is love versus God allows innocent suffering, or faith moves mountains versus unanswered prayers. Either you are salt of the earth versus you are nothing without God. The mind wants to resolve, it wants to create synthesis that eliminates tension. But practice is resisting it, sustaining tension indefinitely, allowing both poles to be true at the same time. And Simone Weil discovered that doing this repeatedly expands awareness, because you develop mental muscles to sustain complexity without collapsing into false simplicity. Real life is full of irreconcilable paradoxes, and if you haven't developed the capacity to sustain them, you will live in constant frustration trying to resolve the unresolvable. The Bible trains you in this capacity systematically. The fourth practice was memorization of seemingly tedious genealogies and lists. This seems crazy. Who wants to memorize Matthew chapter 1, list of generations from Abraham to Jesus? But Simone Weil discovered that memorizing these lists without trying to understand them or extract meaning from them is a form of decreation for the ego that always wants immediate meaning. You recite names that mean nothing to you, generations of people you have never met, and in doing so, you are practicing mindfulness that demands no reward, that needs no intellectual or emotional gratification. And that kind of pure attention, which exists without seeking anything, is exactly the kind of attention that allows grace to enter. Because grace can only enter where there is empty space, and empty space only exists when ego stops demanding that everything have immediate meaning for it. The fifth practice was reading the Bible in a language you don't completely master. Simone Weil read in Greek and Hebrew even when she didn't understand perfectly, because the effort to decipher requires attention differently than reading fluently. When you read fluently, mind skips over words, picking up meaning automatically. When you read with difficulty, you have to stop at each word, contemplate its structure, its etymology, its multiple possibilities of meaning. And this slow process rebuilds your relationship with language. You stop consuming words and start inhabiting words. For most people who do not have access to original languages, equivalent practice would be reading a very literal, uncomfortably literal translation, which forces you to slow down and contemplate the text's structure rather than automatically flowing through it. The sixth practice was what she called reading in distress. Don't avoid difficult or upsetting texts, but go directly to parts of the Bible that seem unbearable and read just when you are in pain. Sorry ions of Jeremiah during depression. Job during existential crisis. Psalms of abandonment when you feel abandoned. Not to find easy solace, but to discover that your affliction has already been articulated, that someone thousands of years ago felt it and turned it into words that still carry the structure of that affliction. And when you find your own pain articulated in sacred text, something changes. Your pain stops being private chaos and becomes part of a larger human pattern. It's not that pain diminishes, it's that it finds a place in architecture. It stops being a monstrosity that shouldn't exist and becomes a recognized part of the human condition that can be sustained within a larger structure. The seventh practice was prayer without petition. Simone Weil discovered that most prayers are attempts to control, disguised as spirituality. You pray for healing, for change of circumstances, for protection, and all of this is ego trying to manipulate reality through God. So she practiced prayer that didn't ask for anything, just remained in presence. Recite Our Father, but stop before the petitions. Just dwell, your kingdom come, your will be done, without adding but make it happen the way I want it. And this practice of remaining without asking is decreation of the ego that always wants to control, and creates space where something other than control can happen. The eighth practice was the study of parables, not as allegories with fixed meanings, but as structural patterns. Parable of the Prodigal Son is not just about God forgiving sinners. It is a pattern of departure, descent, return, reception that can be applied on multiple levels of experience. And Simone Weil practiced identifying this pattern in her own life, not as a forced interpretation, but as a recognition that the same structural patterns that appear in parables appear in real life. And when you start to see patterns instead of random events, life stops being incomprehensible chaos and becomes variations on recognizable themes. And now we have come to the point where we honor what you have had the courage to go through this far, because watching this entire video, allowing these words to touch the deepest structures of your consciousness, this is not a casual pastime. It is an act of courage. Most people run away when the truth begins to become uncomfortable, when it begins to demand not just a change of thought, but a change in the foundation of thought. You stayed. And that says something deep about you, about your willingness to let old structures that aren't working be questioned, about your hunger for something more solid than what modernity offers. Simone Weil would say that you are among the few who still have the capacity for true attention, because attention is rare in a world that has trained everyone to consume information quickly without allowing it to penetrate deeply. So before we continue, I need to ask you something, and you will understand why it is important. If something here resonated with a deep part of your soul that you barely knew existed, if you felt that these words about biblical engineering and mental structure touched the truth that you were searching for without knowing how to name it, then leave a like on this video, because it shows me that this content is really reaching people who need it, people who have the courage to look at the invisible architecture of consciousness instead of continuing to try to fix the surface, and subscribe to the channel so that we can continue this journey together, exploring how ancient structures still work in modern minds, how truths that modernity has discarded remain foundations stronger than anything we have built to replace them. Because you don't have to walk this journey alone. There are others like you seeking the same foundations, and together we can go deeper than anyone would go alone. The invisible engineering of the Bible is not a sophisticated psychological trick. It is not a tool of religious manipulation. It is not a secret code that the spiritual elite keep from others. It is the architecture of human consciousness made visible through text. It is a matrix that was built over thousands of years by people who understood something about the deep workings of the mind that modernity has forgotten. Simone Weil didn't discover this by reading biblical commentaries or studying systematic theology. She discovered it by living, experiencing it in her own flesh and mind, fragmented by pain, testing whether these ancient structures still functioned in tortured modern consciousness. And they worked. They did not eliminate pain, but they provided architecture within which pain could be sustained without completely destroying the person carrying it. They did not resolve existential contradictions, but they expanded the capacity to sustain contradictions without collapsing into despair or cynicism. They did not give simple answers to complex questions, but they trained the mind to inhabit complexity without demanding false simplification. The Bible that Simone Weil discovered is not a book of moral rules or a manual of religious doctrine. It is a technology for building integrated consciousness, developed over centuries by communities that knew that being a human being without an adequate foundation is a human being condemned to fragmentation. And modernity, by discarding this technology as primitive superstition, it did not free us to higher rationality. It left us floating in a psychological void, trying to build a stable identity on a non-existent foundation. You feel that, don't you? The feeling of always building yourself, always trying to discover who you are, always searching for more self-knowledge, but never arriving at something solid enough to stand on when storms come. Because you are trying to be your own foundation, and no one can be their own foundation, it is logical impossibility. You need ground under your feet that doesn't depend on you to exist. And the Bible offers this ground, but ground that you don't control, don't own, don't manipulate, ground that exists before you, that will continue to exist after you, that you can only accept and step on. Simone Weil lived only 34 years, but in those years she descended deeper into the structure of human consciousness than most dare in a lifetime. She found no cure for fragmentation. She found architecture that can sustain fragmentation without collapsing. She found no escape from pain. She found patterns that can organize the experience of pain into something that does not completely destroy it. She didn't find answers that satisfied intellectual ego. She found structures that allowed ego to decree itself enough for something greater to enter. And maybe that's all any of us can really hope for. Not elimination of pain or contradiction or fragmentation, but architecture strong enough to sustain it all without breaking. Structure that allows us to continue existing even when everything inside us is in pieces. The invisible engineering of the Bible still works because human consciousness still works the same way it always has, needing an external foundation, needing structuring patterns, needing larger narratives within which to participate. Modernity has tried to convince us that we have grown beyond this need, that we are too sophisticated, too autonomous, too rational to need old structures. And the result is a mental health epidemic, a crisis of meaning, internal fragmentation that reaches unprecedented proportions. Maybe it's time to admit that modernity has failed to provide adequate foundations, that absolute autonomy is prison and not freedom, that you cannot build yourself from nothing and need to accept being inserted into something bigger than yourself. The Bible is still here, still offering the same architecture that sustained Simone Weil through pain that would have destroyed any modern psychological structure. Not because it's religious truth that you need to accept on blind faith, but because it's engineering tested through millennia of human experience. You don't have to believe everything the Bible says to benefit from its architecture. You just need to be willing to be inserted into the patterns, inhabit the structures, allow old words to rebuild the foundation of your thinking. Simone Weil was never officially Christian. She was never baptized. She maintained a critical distance from religious institutions until her death. But she allowed the Bible to rebuild her from the inside out, and that was enough to transform a mind fragmented by pain into a consciousness capable of producing some of the most profound philosophies of the 20th century. Keep looking for invisible structures that organize your thinking. Keep questioning whether the foundations you have are solid enough. Keep allowing ancient truths to test modern truths. Because that's exactly what Simone Weil would do. And that's exactly what your fractured mind most needs you to do.